The debt ceiling is a limit on how much money the U.S. government can borrow to pay for its spending. It was first created by Congress in 1917 to give the Treasury Department more flexibility in financing World War I. Since then, Congress has raised the debt ceiling 78 times, usually without much controversy. However, in recent years, the debt ceiling has become a source of political conflict and economic uncertainty. The U.S. government spends more than it collects in taxes almost every year. This creates a budget deficit, which adds to the national debt. The national debt is the total amount of money that the government owes to its creditors, such as other countries, investors, and federal agencies. As of May 2023, the national debt stands at $31.4 trillion, which is equal to the current debt ceiling. The government borrows money by issuing bonds and other securities that promise to pay back the principal plus interest over time. The Treasury Department is responsible for managing the government's borrowing and paying its bills. However, it can only borrow up to the limit set by Congress. If the government spends more than it borrows, it runs out of cash and risks defaulting on its obligations. This is why the debt ceiling is a crisis. If Congress does not raise the debt ceiling before the Treasury runs out of cash, the government will not be able to pay all of its bills on time. This could include payments for Social Security, Medicare, military salaries, interest on the debt, and more. A default would have severe consequences for the economy and the global financial system. It could trigger a recession, a spike in interest rates, a loss of confidence in the U.S. dollar, and a downgrade of the U.S. credit rating. To avoid a default crisis, Congress needs to act quickly and raise the debt ceiling before it is too late. However, some lawmakers may use this opportunity to demand spending cuts or other policy changes in exchange for their support. This could create a political deadlock and increase the risk of a default. The White House has urged Congress to raise the debt ceiling without conditions and warned that failing to do so would be irresponsible and reckless. What are the consequences of a default? A default is a scenario where the U.S. government fails to pay its bills because it has reached its legal borrowing limit, also known as the debt ceiling. A default would have serious and lasting impacts on the U.S. economy and its people. Here are some of the possible effects. A default would undermine the U.S. credit rating, which is a measure of how trustworthy the U.S. is as a borrower. The U.S. has always been seen as a safe and reliable debtor, but a default would shatter that reputation and signal to the world that the U.S. cannot manage its finances. This could lead to a downgrade of the U.S. credit rating by agencies like Moody's and Standard & Poor's, which would make it harder and more expensive for the U.S. to borrow money in the future. A default would cause turmoil in financial markets, both at home and abroad. The U.S. Treasury bonds are widely held by investors, banks, central banks, pension funds, and other institutions as a low-risk and stable asset. If the U.S. fails to pay its bondholders on time, it would trigger a sell-off of Treasury bonds and other assets, leading to a sharp drop in their prices and a spike in their yields, interest rates. This would create panic and uncertainty in the markets, potentially sparking a global financial crisis. A default would increase borrowing costs for everyone. As the interest rates on Treasury bonds rise, so do the interest rates on other types of loans, such as mortgages, credit cards, student loans, car loans, and business loans. This would make it more difficult and expensive for consumers and businesses to borrow money, reducing their spending and investment. Higher borrowing costs would also increase the debt burden for the U.S. government and other borrowers, making it harder to repay their debts. A default would hurt the economy and consumers. A default would reduce the amount of money that the government can spend on essential programs and services, such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, education, and infrastructure. This would affect millions of Americans who rely on these benefits or work for the government. A default would also reduce consumer confidence and spending, as people worry about their financial security and future. A default could also trigger a recession, or a period of negative economic growth, which would result in lower incomes, higher unemployment, and more poverty. As you can see, a default would have devastating consequences for the U.S. economy and its people. That's why it's crucial that Congress and the White House find a way to resolve the debt ceiling crisis before it's too late. What are the solutions and challenges? Discuss the options for raising the debt ceiling, such as a bipartisan agreement, reconciliation, or abolishing the limit altogether, and the political obstacles and risks involved. The debt ceiling is a legal limit on how much the federal government can borrow to pay its bills. It was created by Congress in 1917 and has been raised or suspended 98 times since then. The current debt limit is $31.4 trillion and it was reached on December 31, 2022. Since then, the Treasury Department has been using extraordinary measures to avoid defaulting on its obligations, but these measures will run out sometime this summer. If Congress does not act to raise or suspend the debt ceiling before then, the U.S. could face a default disaster that would have severe consequences for the economy and the global financial system. A default would mean that the government could not pay its creditors, its employees, its contractors, its beneficiaries, or its other obligations on time or in full. This would damage the U.S. credit rating, increase borrowing costs, trigger legal challenges, disrupt financial markets, and undermine confidence in the dollar as the world's reserve currency. So what are the possible solutions to this crisis? And what are the challenges and risks involved? One possible solution is for Congress to pass a bipartisan bill that raises the debt ceiling and includes measures to address the long-term fiscal challenges facing the U.S. This would require compromise and cooperation from both parties, which may be difficult to achieve given the political polarization and gridlock in Washington. Moreover, such a bill could face opposition from some lawmakers who oppose raising the debt ceiling on principle or who want to use it as leverage to extract concessions on other issues. Another possible solution is for Congress to use a special budget procedure called reconciliation to raise the debt ceiling with a simple majority vote in both chambers. This would bypass the need for 60 votes in the Senate to overcome a filibuster. However, reconciliation has its own rules and limitations that could complicate its use for this purpose. For example, reconciliation can only be used once per fiscal year and it must be consistent with a budget resolution that sets spending and revenue targets. Furthermore, reconciliation could also face resistance from some lawmakers who prefer a bipartisan approach or who disagree with other aspects of the budget plan. A third possible solution is for Congress to abolish the debt ceiling altogether or make it automatic based on certain criteria. This would eliminate the risk of default and reduce uncertainty for investors and markets. However, this option could also face political hurdles as some lawmakers may view it as irresponsible or unconstitutional. Additionally, some experts argue that abolishing the debt ceiling could reduce fiscal discipline and accountability and increase moral hazard. As you can see, there is no easy or perfect solution to the debt ceiling dilemma. Each option has its pros and cons and its supporters and opponents. The only thing that is certain is that time is running out and action is needed soon to avoid a default disaster that could have devastating consequences for the U.S. and the world.